What if I told you that one of the most powerful dynasties in history never ruled a country, never wore a crown, and never commanded an army, yet quietly shaped the modern world as we know it? You won't find their faces on coins or in royal portraits, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in your fuel, your medicine, your university, even the skyline of New York City. Their name became a symbol of unimaginable wealth and quiet control. Presidents sought their advice, nations depended on their industries, and for over a century they managed to influence global economics without ever needing a throne. This is the story of the Rockefellers, the family that built an empire so vast, so interconnected, that even kings looked small in comparison. But how did a boy from a poor New York household rise to control the world's most powerful oil monopoly and turn his last name into a dynasty that still shapes global power today? To understand how they did it, we have to go back to where it all began, with a young bookkeeper who believed that discipline, not destiny, could buy a kingdom.
John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a small wooden farmhouse in Richford, New York. There was no sign that the child in that humble home would one day become the richest man in modern history. No royal lineage, no noble birth, just a family scraping by, trying to survive in a harsh and changing America. His father, William Devil Bill Rockefeller, was a man of many faces. A traveling salesman, a self-proclaimed botanical doctor, and, some say, a con artist. He sold worthless miracle tonics, boasting they could cure anything from baldness to cancer. He had two families at the same time, lived under false names, and taught his children one ruthless lesson. The world is full of fools, and it's your job not to be one of them. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was his opposite. Deeply religious, frugal, and disciplined. She raised her children with a strict moral compass. She taught John to live simply, work honestly, and never waste a cent. Every coin had to be accounted for. Every action had consequences. Between his father's cunning and his mother's discipline, John learned the perfect balance between charm and control, the two traits that would later define his empire. As a boy, he was quiet, serious, and almost unnervingly focused. While other children played outside, John kept ledgers, literally ledgers, pages filled with numbers. He tracked every penny he earned and spent, developing an almost spiritual relationship with money. To him, money wasn't greed, it was order, proof that the world could be measured, understood, and mastered. At 16, Rockefeller took his first job as a bookkeeper for a small produce commission firm in Cleveland. He earned just 50 cents a day, but he studied every line in the company's books. He watched how businessmen negotiated, how they priced goods, how credit and debt danced around each other like predators in prey. He realized something powerful. Money flowed to those who controlled information. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, it turned America into a nation of sudden opportunity. Soldiers needed supplies, industries needed contracts, and railroads needed expansion. For many, it was chaos. For Rockefeller, it was a spreadsheet waiting to be balanced. While other men rushed into speculative businesses, Rockefeller remained calm. He avoided wild risks and focused on consistency. Small, predictable profits compounded over time. When his business partners grew impatient, he bought them out. Slowly, silently, he began tightening his control over everything he touched. Then came oil, the black, sticky liquid that would change the world. In 1859, the first oil well struck crude in Pennsylvania, and the rush began. Towns exploded overnight. Fortune seekers flooded the fields. The smell of money and oil filled the air. But the business was chaos. Wells leaked. Transportation was inefficient. Prices rose and crashed like storms. To most men, it was a gamble. To Rockefeller, it was an equation. He saw that the real money wasn't in drilling oil, it was in refining it. Whoever could make the process cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable would control the entire industry. So in 1863, he partnered with Samuel Andrews, a talented chemist, and built a small refinery in Cleveland. Andrews refined, Rockefeller organized. Together they made a simple promise to themselves: make oil predictable. Rockefeller kept ledgers as if they were holy texts. Every expense, every barrel, every rail shipment was logged, analyzed, optimized. Waste was sin. Efficiency was salvation. When asked about his obsession with control, he once said, "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity." And that philosophy worked. Within a few years, his refinery became the largest in Cleveland, not by luck, but by design. He negotiated special deals with railroads to transport oil cheaper than his competitors. He reinvested profits into more refineries. He bought out rivals, not through violence, but through mathematics. He knew their weaknesses better than they did. Every move was quiet, every acquisition precise. He was building something far bigger than a business. He was building a system, one that could bend the rules of capitalism itself. By 1870, Rockefeller founded Standard Oil Company, the seed of what would become one of the most powerful corporations in history. But the transformation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The shy bookkeeper had become an empire builder, not through charisma, not through armies, but through control. To Rockefeller, control was everything. Control over prices, control over competitors, control over fate. And as the oil business exploded across America, he tightened his grip with surgical precision. He was no longer playing the game, he was quietly rewriting the rules. The boy who once counted pennies in a notebook was about to count profits larger than the GDP of entire nations. And this was only the beginning. Because what Rockefeller built next wouldn't just change business, it would redefine power itself.
By the late 1860s, America was running on ambition. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories roared day and night. The age of steam had turned the nation into an economic engine, but that engine needed fuel. And in the darkness of oil fields from Pennsylvania to Ohio, John D. Rockefeller saw something that no one else did. Not just oil, but order. A way to tame chaos and turn it into an empire. Most oilmen of the time were gamblers. They struck wells, hit fortune, and lost it again in the same breath. Prices for crude oil swung wildly. The industry was flooded with small refineries, run by opportunists chasing quick cash. To Rockefeller, this chaos was opportunity disguised as noise. He believed the oil business needed structure, and he would be the one to give it. In 1870, Rockefeller, along with his partners Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, and a few trusted investors, founded Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The name itself carried a message: standard, reliability, consistency, control. His goal wasn't to drill more oil, but to refine it better, ship it cheaper, and sell it everywhere. From the start, Standard Oil operated like a machine. Rockefeller implemented military-style discipline, meticulous bookkeeping, precise measurements, zero waste. Every process was studied and improved. If a byproduct could be sold, like gasoline, paraffin, or lubricants, it was packaged and marketed. Nothing was wasted. In an industry ruled by speculation, Rockefeller built predictability. But behind his calm smile and quiet voice was an unmatched ruthlessness. He believed competition was inefficient. It led to instability, and instability was bad for business. So he set out to eliminate it completely. He began by targeting rival refineries in Cleveland. Instead of crushing them outright, he approached them with a deal: join Standard Oil or be driven out of business. Some saw the wisdom in surrender, others refused, and soon found themselves unable to compete with Rockefeller's lower shipping rates and massive scale. What his competitors didn't know was that Rockefeller had secret agreements with the railroads.
Through his allies in transport, he secured discounted shipping rates and even rebates that made it impossible for others to match his prices. In effect, every time a rival shipped oil, Standard Oil made money on it. This web of hidden deals gave Rockefeller complete dominance. By 1872, in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, he bought out 22 of the city's 26 competing refineries in just 6 weeks. But Rockefeller didn't brag. He didn't boast about being the biggest or the best. He simply smiled and said, "We must ever remember we are refining oil for the poor man, and he must have it cheap and good." To the public, he was a businessman providing stability. To those inside the industry, he was a force of nature, calm, silent, and unstoppable. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the oil refining in the United States. Every pipeline, every barrel, every gallon of kerosene passed through his network. His company didn't just make money, it dictated prices, influenced markets, and shaped government policy. He built refineries across states, warehouses by the rail lines, and shipping routes overseas. The company became so vast that journalists began comparing Rockefeller not to a businessman, but to a monarch. And yet he never sought fame. He rarely gave interviews. His silence became his shield. While the public saw philanthropy and efficiency, few saw the hidden empire forming behind closed doors. Standard Oil became a trust, a new kind of structure in American business. It allowed Rockefeller to consolidate dozens of companies under one central control, each legally independent, but ultimately answering to him. This system was so effective that other industries copied it: steel, railroads, tobacco, all inspired by Rockefeller's invisible grip. He once wrote that competition is a sin, and for him, it truly was. Because in his eyes, competition wasted energy. He wasn't playing capitalism, he was perfecting it. And while politicians debated free markets, Rockefeller quietly built a system that was anything but free. It was total control, achieved not through war, but through contracts, secrecy, and patience. By the time the U.S. government began to notice, it was already too late. The Rockefeller name had become synonymous with wealth, stability, and power. He was no longer just a man who sold oil. He had become something else, something closer to a king without a crown, ruling not over land, but over the invisible veins of an industrial nation. And yet, he wasn't done. Because while Standard Oil conquered America's energy, Rockefeller's next move would reach even further, into the banks, the universities, and even the minds of the people who hated him most. The oil empire was only the beginning.
By the time the 1880s rolled around, John D. Rockefeller had already achieved what most men would call impossible. He had conquered an entire industry. His company refined nearly every drop of oil in the United States. Railroads bent to his will. Politicians feared him. Rivals disappeared. But Rockefeller wasn't chasing wealth anymore. He was chasing something far greater: legacy. For him, money was just the beginning. What mattered now was control, not just of oil, but of America itself. He once said, "Next to doing the right thing, the most important thing is to let people know you are doing the right thing." And that became his new mission, to turn power into respect. He understood that business empires were temporary. They rise and fall with markets. But ideas, institutions, and reputations, those could last forever. So Rockefeller began the quiet transformation from industrial tycoon to social architect. He poured millions into building foundations, universities, and charities, not out of guilt, but out of vision. In 1890, he funded the creation of the University of Chicago, which quickly became one of the most prestigious universities in the world. He donated more than $80 million to it, the modern equivalent of billions.
Then came the Rockefeller Foundation, launched in 1913. Its mission was global, to promote the well-being of mankind. Behind those words lay a revolution in how the ultra-rich exercised influence. Through the foundation, Rockefeller's money shaped science, medicine, education, and global policy. It helped fund breakthroughs that eradicated diseases, trained future leaders, and even influenced public health models still used today. But there was a deeper side to it, subtle, strategic, and far-reaching. Philanthropy gave the Rockefellers something money alone could not: moral authority. The same man once vilified for crushing competition now appeared in headlines as a humanitarian, a man who gave back to society. And it worked. Slowly, the public image of the Rockefeller family shifted. Newspapers began portraying them not as villains of greed, but as architects of progress. The empire no longer wore the face of Standard Oil. It now wore the face of hospitals, schools, libraries, and research centers. But make no mistake, the family's influence only deepened. By the early 20th century, Rockefeller's reach extended far beyond oil. He invested heavily in finance, forming deep ties with the nation's banking elite, particularly through Chase National Bank, which would eventually evolve into Chase Manhattan, one of the pillars of modern American finance. He moved into real estate, reshaping New York City's skyline. The family commissioned the construction of Rockefeller Center, a 22-acre complex of skyscrapers that became a symbol of American ambition during the Great Depression, a literal monument to the family's legacy, built in stone, steel, and confidence. Even global politics felt their influence. Through their foundations and business networks, the Rockefellers quietly supported programs that would later influence the United Nations, public health systems, and international education initiatives. They didn't rule nations, they funded them. They didn't crown themselves kings, they crowned institutions that would outlive them. And that's how they built an empire without a throne. While monarchs throughout history needed armies to enforce power, Rockefeller had something even more powerful: public trust. He learned to move behind the scenes, letting ideas, not faces, carry influence. When asked about his massive charitable spending, Rockefeller said, "The best philanthropy is constantly in search of the finalities, a search for cause, an attempt to cure evils at their source." But for critics, that statement carried a darker implication. Was Rockefeller curing evils, or defining what evil meant? When you fund the research, the medicine, the schools, and the media, do you shape progress, or do you control it? That's the paradox of the Rockefeller legacy. They became the world's most famous benefactors while quietly steering the direction of that very world. And their transformation wasn't just about reputation. It was a strategy, a way to preserve the dynasty forever. When governments cracked down on monopolies, the Rockefellers shifted their power into trusts, foundations, and holding companies, legal fortresses that would protect their wealth and influence across generations. They realized that the future wasn't about who owned the oil wells, it was about who funded the future. So while kings ruled nations with crowns, Rockefeller ruled progress with capital. He didn't conquer territory, he conquered ideas. And that kind of power is harder to see, harder to challenge, and almost impossible to destroy. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, he had given away over $500 million, but still left behind one of the greatest fortunes ever amassed. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., would continue the mission, expanding the empire's influence even further into culture, architecture, and global policy. The family name had transcended business. It had become an idea, a symbol of quiet authority. They had done what no royal dynasty ever could. They built an empire without a crown, and no one could take it away. But as the Rockefellers' power grew, so did the backlash. Because for every empire, no matter how invisible, there comes a moment when the world starts to question who's really in control. Every empire reaches a point when its power becomes too visible, too absolute to ignore. For the Rockefellers, that moment came when the American public finally realized one simple, terrifying truth. One man controlled nearly every drop of oil in the country. By the late 1900s, Standard Oil had become the most powerful company in the world. It owned the wells, the pipelines, the railroads, the refineries, the tankers, everything. And it didn't just dominate oil, it defined capitalism itself. Competitors didn't compete, they survived, if Rockefeller allowed it. Prices were fixed, rivals crushed, and government officials were quietly persuaded to look the other way. It was brilliant, it was efficient, and it was ruthless. For years, the public had no idea just how deep Standard Oil's control went. But that changed in 1902 when a journalist named Ida Tarbell decided to investigate. Her father had been one of the small businessmen destroyed by Rockefeller's tactics. She wanted answers. Her exposé, The History of the Standard Oil Company, became one of the most devastating pieces of investigative journalism ever written. It exposed the secret deals, the hidden monopolies, the cutthroat price wars, and the silent political manipulation that kept Rockefeller's empire untouchable. America was shocked. The man once seen as a symbol of success was now portrayed as a puppet master, manipulating the entire economy for personal gain. Tarbell described him as a man of deep religious faith, yet whose business methods were cruel and heartless. The public fury was unstoppable. The U.S. government, which had long ignored Standard Oil's dominance, finally took action. In 1911, after years of legal battles, the Supreme Court declared Standard Oil a monopoly and ordered it broken up into 34 separate companies. It was, in theory, a devastating blow, the end of Rockefeller's empire, the triumph of justice over greed. But here's the twist. Rockefeller didn't lose, he multiplied. When Standard Oil was broken apart, Rockefeller still owned massive shares in each of the new companies. Those new companies included giants that would later become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco. And when those new company stock prices skyrocketed, so did Rockefeller's wealth. The breakup that was meant to destroy him actually made him richer than ever. He had turned a government punishment into a personal payday. It was the ultimate demonstration of his philosophy. Control the system so completely that even defeat becomes profit. But beyond the numbers, something more profound was happening. Rockefeller's influence was no longer confined to oil. His wealth had become self-replicating, flowing into banks, railroads, mining, real estate, and later global finance. His children and grandchildren would carry that strategy even further. They learned that controlling industries wasn't the real power, controlling capital was, and the institutions that managed it, banks, foundations, and universities. By mid-century, the Rockefeller family had embedded themselves at the very center of American life. Their fingerprints were on everything. Chase National Bank, which later merged into Chase Manhattan, then J.P. Morgan Chase. Rockefeller Center, a symbol of cultural power in New York. The Rockefeller Foundation, which funded global health and education programs. And deep connections to government, especially through figures like Nelson Rockefeller, who became U.S. Vice President in 1974. Their power had evolved from visible industry to invisible influence, and that invisibility was their greatest protection. But with power comes suspicion. By the mid-20th century, whispers grew louder. People began asking uncomfortable questions. Did the Rockefellers influence the creation of the Federal Reserve? Were they connected to the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission? Did they have a hand in steering global politics behind closed doors? To some, the family had become philanthropists. To others, they were the architects of a new kind of empire, one ruled not by kings or armies, but by capital and connections. David Rockefeller, the family's most public face in the late 20th century, didn't deny their reach. In fact, he seemed to embrace it.
In his 2002 autobiography, he wrote, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it." It was the most unguarded acknowledgement of elite influence ever written by a Rockefeller. Yet to this day, their story blurs the line between conspiracy and reality. Were they simply smart capitalists who understood systems better than anyone else? Or architects of something deeper, something that quietly shaped the world's direction? Either way, their control was undeniable. When others played business, the Rockefellers played civilization itself. They had rewritten the rules of empire. You don't need to rule the people, just rule the money that moves them.
When John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, at the age of 97, America lost not just a man, but the architect of an invisible empire. He left behind more than $400 million, a fortune so vast it made him the world's first billionaire when adjusted for inflation. But that money wasn't meant to simply sit in vaults or estates. It was engineered to last. Rockefeller had learned a hard truth about wealth. Fortune fades, power doesn't, if you know how to preserve it. While most tycoons of his era obsessed over profit, Rockefeller obsessed over structure. He built his empire like a machine, each part reinforcing the next. His sons and grandsons wouldn't just inherit wealth, they would inherit a system designed to renew itself with every generation. And the heart of that system wasn't oil, or land, or even stocks. It was philanthropy. To most people, charity is generosity. To the Rockefellers, it was strategy, a way to shape society while appearing to serve it. In 1913, he founded the Rockefeller Foundation, a move that changed the relationship between wealth and power forever. Its mission was simple on paper: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. But behind that benevolent phrase was a masterstroke of influence. By funding medicine, education, and global development, the Rockefellers positioned themselves at the center of every major global initiative without ever holding political office. They financed breakthroughs in medical science, helping to eradicate diseases like hookworm and yellow fever. They shaped education, funding universities, public schools, and social sciences that would later define modern academia. And they quietly influenced foreign policy, partnering with governments and global institutions in ways that blurred the line between private philanthropy and public power. Every dollar spent bought not just goodwill, but access. Access to politicians, universities, scientists, and world leaders. It was empire building in its most refined form. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who took over the family legacy, perfected this model. He donated land for the United Nations headquarters in New York, ensuring that the global heart of diplomacy would forever beat on Rockefeller ground. And his son, David Rockefeller, expanded the family's reach beyond the U.S., turning philanthropy into global diplomacy. David became the bridge between Wall Street and world power. He chaired Chase Manhattan Bank, helped form the Trilateral Commission, and held deep ties to the Council on Foreign Relations, groups that, to many, symbolize the merging of financial and political influence on a planetary scale. But here's the genius. The Rockefellers didn't seek to control governments outright. They sought to guide them by funding the people and institutions that governments relied on. Universities produced policymakers. Think tanks shaped ideas. Foundations financed global programs. And behind much of it, quietly, were the Rockefellers. Through these layers, they turned money into ideology, and ideology into policy. Their influence became so woven into modern systems that removing it would mean unraveling entire sectors of society: healthcare, education, global finance, even the environmental movement.
In fact, in the 1970s, the same family whose fortune came from fossil fuels began funding environmental research and climate awareness campaigns. It wasn't irony, it was adaptation. They understood something most dynasties never learn. Power survives when it evolves. By supporting renewable energy, sustainability, and conservation, they ensured their name remained relevant, even as the oil age they built began to fade. And through it all, they maintained the one thing every dynasty craves, but few achieve: respect. While other wealthy families faded into history, the Rockefellers became a brand of virtue. Philanthropy made them untouchable. Their institutions, from the Rockefeller Foundation to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, continue to operate globally, shaping policy under the banner of progress. But behind that reputation lies a calculated truth. The Rockefellers mastered the art of legacy, not through dominance, but through integration. Their power doesn't sit on a throne. It flows through systems, invisible, yet undeniable. They built an empire that outlived its founder, not by clinging to the past, but by constantly writing the future. Each generation has its role: the banker, the diplomat, the philanthropist, the environmentalist. Together, they maintain balance and continuity. Today, their direct control of oil is long gone, but their influence, it's everywhere. In foundations, financial institutions, universities, and global policy networks. Even now, the Rockefeller name carries a weight that no corporation can match, not because of what they own, but because of what they engineered. A dynasty designed not for fame, but for forever. But there's still one question left unanswered. How did the Rockefellers manage to hold on to power while so many other empires, from monarchs to magnates, collapsed under their own greed? The answer lies in what they understood better than anyone else. Power is perception. In history, every great empire eventually reveals its weakness: a scandal, a betrayal, a downfall. But somehow, the Rockefellers never did. Their empire wasn't invincible, it was invisible, and that made it almost impossible to destroy. You see, real power isn't about control, it's about perception, and the Rockefellers mastered that like no one else. They understood that the richest man in the world would always be a target. So instead of clinging to their image as oil barons or tycoons, they transformed it. They became philanthropists, humanitarians, visionaries. Their story shifted from greed to generosity, from monopoly to modernity. And the brilliance of that transformation is that the world believed it. When people thought of the Rockefellers, they didn't picture oil refineries or corporate boardrooms anymore. They pictured hospitals, universities, and research centers. They pictured progress. The same family accused of controlling global economics became the family funding medical breakthroughs. The dynasty once called soulless became the benefactors of culture and art. And with that single shift in narrative, they did what no crown or army could ever do. They disappeared into admiration. But make no mistake, the power never vanished. It simply went underground. Their fortune, spread through hundreds of trusts, partnerships, and foundations, became untraceable in the traditional sense. No single Rockefeller held the entire empire. Instead, the wealth was distributed through structure, managed by boards, trustees, and interlocking institutions that all answered to the same family philosophy. They didn't need to own everything directly. They just needed to influence everything subtly. And influence, unlike ownership, doesn't show up on balance sheets. Consider this.
The Rockefeller Foundation helped shape the World Health Organization and early public health systems. The family's think tanks, like the Council on Foreign Relations, influenced American foreign policy for decades. Their funding of social sciences at major universities helped define the way modern economies and societies are studied. They weren't just part of history, they were writing it. Even when conspiracy theories began to swirl, accusing them of global control, secret societies, and hidden agendas, the Rockefellers didn't deny it or defend themselves. They simply stayed silent, because they knew something their critics didn't. Silence feeds mystery, and mystery feeds power. By the late 19th century, their influence had become so diffused across industries and nations that no one could point to a single figure and say, "That's the Rockefeller in charge." And that was by design. Each generation diversified. Bankers, politicians, environmentalists, philanthropists, each appeared independent, but together they formed a web of influence that reached every major sector of society. Finance, energy, media, education, all connected by invisible threads. This diffusion was their protection. When one part of the system was criticized, another part defended it. When their oil legacy came under fire, their environmental initiatives absorbed the blow. They played both sides, profit and progress, and in doing so, they neutralized opposition before it even formed. It was the perfect balance of visibility and invisibility. They were everywhere and nowhere. David Rockefeller once said, "Success in business requires training, discipline, and hard work. But if you're not frightened by these things, opportunities are just as great today as they ever were." It wasn't just advice, it was a confession, a reminder that fear controls most people, but not them. They weren't afraid to be hated as long as they remained essential. They weren't afraid to lose control as long as they controlled perception. And they weren't afraid to let go of power because they knew it would always return through the systems they built. That's the paradox of the Rockefellers. They created the illusion of stepping back when in reality they had already built the stage. Even in the 21st century, their influence endures in Wall Street institutions, global health initiatives, environmental policy, and philanthropy networks. The empire without a crown became a network without borders. And that's the secret every modern dynasty tries to imitate. You don't need to rule the world when you've already shaped the systems that run it. But there's one last piece to this puzzle, one that explains why, despite their power, the Rockefellers remain admired, even respected. It's not wealth or influence that keeps their legacy alive. It's something far more human and far more calculated.
Most dynasties fade when the founder dies. Their wealth scatters, their children fight, their power dissolves into memory. But the Rockefellers, they built something different, something alive, a self-sustaining machine of legacy that doesn't need a single ruler to keep running. John D. Rockefeller didn't just pass down money, he passed down a mindset, a belief that discipline and structure could outlast chaos and change. And so he designed his fortune not as a mountain of gold, but as a blueprint for continuity. Every generation was trained to play a role, not as heirs, but as stewards. Their wealth wasn't just inherited, it was managed, measured, and multiplied according to rules set more than a century ago. The family built councils, trusts, and boards that governed everything from investments to philanthropy. No one person could destroy the system because no one person ever controlled it. Power was spread out, yet perfectly synchronized, like gears in a clock that never stops ticking. This was the Rockefeller formula for immortality. While other dynasties lived for ego, they lived for continuity. They didn't build monuments, they built institutions. They didn't seek fame, They sought permanence. And that's the difference between wealth and legacy. Through the Rockefeller Foundation, they embedded their influence into the DNA of global systems. Through universities, they shaped minds. Through banks, they shaped markets. Through philanthropy, they shaped morality. Each branch of the family pursued influence in a different way: political, financial, cultural, but always aligned to the same invisible mission: to remain indispensable. That's why, even after more than a century, the Rockefeller name still holds power without ever having to wield it publicly. They understood that influence doesn't depend on visibility, it depends on structure. Their wealth isn't static, it's fluid, moving through nonprofits, investment firms, environmental initiatives, and global development projects. It flows like oil once did, unseen but essential. And here's the most remarkable part. The Rockefellers turned the act of giving away money into a form of control. Every donation built new connections. Universities, research programs, global partnerships. Every foundation grant came with influence. Every gift was a seed planted in the soil of society, growing into networks that ensured the family's continued relevance. They built a feedback loop. Wealth creating influence, influence creating opportunity, opportunity creating more wealth. A system that regenerates itself, quietly, efficiently, endlessly. And perhaps that's the real reason the Rockefeller empire never fell. It was never just about oil, money, or even power. It was about design. A design that turned capitalism itself into a form of inheritance. They had built an empire without a crown, because crowns can be taken, but systems cannot. Today, the Rockefeller name sits behind initiatives that promote climate change action, global health reform, and social justice, causes that sound like the opposite of the ruthless oil empire that built their fortune. But in a strange way, it's the ultimate evolution of their strategy. They've transcended the idea of a family fortune. They've become an idea, one that shapes policy, business, and global development without needing to claim credit. When people talk about influence today, billionaire philanthropists, global elites, hidden power structures, they're walking paths the Rockefellers paved over a century ago. The family's presence is quiet now, almost ghost-like. But that's the brilliance of the machine. It doesn't need to be seen to be in control. The empire lives on, in foundations, in universities, in the invisible threads connecting governments, corporations, and culture. A legacy so deeply woven into the fabric of society that it no longer needs the Rockefeller name to sustain it. And that's what John D. Rockefeller achieved. Not wealth, not fame, but immortality through influence. Because in the end, power doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who build systems that whisper forever. The Rockefellers never ruled a kingdom. They never led armies, seized palaces, or conquered nations. And yet, when you trace the arteries of modern civilization, the banks, the oil giants, the universities, the medical foundations, the international councils, their fingerprints are there, everywhere. Their story isn't just one of money, but of mastery. They mastered systems, perception, and time itself. They learned that control doesn't come from power you show. It comes from power you don't need to show anymore. John D. Rockefeller began as a poor boy balancing pennies in a notebook. By the time he died, those pennies had multiplied into the architecture of global finance. And long after his death, his descendants continued the work, refining, adapting, evolving, until their influence became almost indistinguishable from the world's natural order. That's the genius and the danger of the empire they built. Because when power becomes invisible, Accountability disappears with it. You can question kings. You can overthrow dictators. But how do you challenge a family whose power hides behind philanthropy, progress, and good intentions? Maybe that's the final lesson of the Rockefellers. They didn't just change the world. They taught it how to be ruled without realizing it. They proved that in the modern age, the crown doesn't sit on the head, it sits in the system. And those who build the system never have to wear it. Their story is the blueprint for every silent empire that followed. From global finance to tech billionaires, the same philosophy endures. Own the structure, not the spotlight. Shape the rules, not the headlines. Be essential, but never obvious. That's how empires survive revolutions, elections, and even centuries. So the next time you fill your car, or walk through Rockefeller Center, or read about a global initiative backed by a foundation you've never heard of, remember this: the empire never disappeared. It simply learned to move in silence, because the Rockefellers didn't need a throne. They built something far more enduring: an empire without a crown.